welcome to the SOA Forum. Thank you. Tonight's resolution reads, the U.S. Supreme Court's 2023 decision to dismantle affirmative action in American higher education marked a significant regression in the pursuit of racial equality. Please vote yes, no, or undecided on this resolution. Here to defend the resolution, taking the affirmative, Professor Paul Frymer. Paul, please come to the stage. Opposing the resolution, Jason Riley. Jason, please come to the stage. Lucas, please close the voting. Paul, you have 15 minutes to defend the resolution. I'm going to give you the podium. Take it away, Paul.
All right. Thank you very much. Trying to remember the time there, so I know aware.
Talk a little bit into the mic.
There. Yeah. Okay, I'll talk into the mic. So this is actually my very first debate. I've done a lot of public speaking, but my very first debate, I was rejected when I applied for the speech and debate club in high school, and I never got another chance to do it. So I'm fulfilling a lifelong dream here, and I appreciate that. I also have a really bad habit if I've got an extra 20 minutes or half hour to sit in a back room while looking at my printed out, nicely clean notes to start scribbling on them. And so, of course, as I scribble, and I tell myself every single time, I'm then not going to be able to read my handwriting because I just put an arrow into the side and so forth. So that's for me to deal with as we move forward. Thank you for having me. I am here to argue that the recent Supreme Court decision in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard was a regression in the pursuit of racial equality, and I'm here to argue for affirmative action. I do think affirmative action policy is a critical piece of broader anti-discrimination efforts to promote greater racial and economic equality in the United States. Let me say as well, though, that I do think affirmative action is a complicated policy. It's had a lot of successes. I think it's also had failures. These successes and failures have been uneven across time. There are different spheres of affirmative action, some things in certain types of sectors and in others, and we use affirmative action differently in those sectors. So affirmative action is complicated. The data on affirmative action is further complicated. Affirmative action itself is actually not that big a policy. And that's true in education, and it's even true, in the workplace. We have much bigger policies when we think about the federal budget and the policy process and the like than affirmative action. And so when we look for broad data on affirmative action, it can be hard to find. A lot of the studies that look at affirmative action try to look at specific sectors, and even within those sectors, the building trades in New York City, the University of California admissions process after the end of affirmative action, Prop 209. So the data is not great. In fact, a lot of the data, if you look at economists who discuss these questions of is affirmative action working or not, a lot of what they're doing is kind of making small claims, and they're recognizing the data is complicated, and they're trying to make little small pieces moving forward. So I want to, I don't want to oversell. I think a lot of people do oversell and oversell either way, whether affirmative action is all good or all bad. I think affirmative action is complicated. I also think affirmative action, it's part of a piece of something. It's part of a broader piece of anti-discrimination policy and law, but it's just a piece. All right, so I'm going to start with what I see as the origins and development of affirmative action, where I link it pretty tightly, not everyone would, to anti-discrimination policies and anti-discrimination law. I'll then talk a bit about how affirmative action shifts, especially in higher education. It moves from anti-discrimination to diversity. Affirmative action has had, as such, lots of critics. Thomas Sowell's book on black education in the early 1970s is a starter with that. William Julius Wilson, so Thomas Sowell on the right, William Julius Wilson on the left. I don't know whose water this is, but it was right there, so I'm going to grab it and take a sip. Have my Marco Rubio moment. William Julius Wilson, The Declining Significance of Race. The class has replaced race as the predominant barrier to pursuing greater equality. So on both sides of the aisle, we have real complications, smart, intelligent discourse about this topic. After I do this, assuming I've got a few minutes, I'd like to actually talk a bit about the data. And here, I'd also want to gauge with Jason's recent book, The Affirmative Action Myth. One of the real pleasures of reading the book is he deals with a lot of data, and he cites a lot of the people that I read and know and so forth. And so I want to kind of engage with that a bit. And then I'll conclude with a forceful claim as to why we need affirmative action and why it should stay. All right. So affirmative action's beginnings. Affirmative action comes out of anti-discrimination policy. And what I mean by that is that it starts with countering direct discrimination. It starts early in the 20th century. A. Philip Randolph, the Roosevelt administration, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, they all saw very early on widespread discrimination, and they needed an active role of the government to do something about it. And it starts even earlier with the Woodrow Wilson administration in the 19-teens, but it creeps and moves into the 1940s with the FEPC. It moves in with the 1950s. You get Brown v. Board of Education and more pushing in the 1960s. John Kennedy's executive order 10925, which takes further steps targeting federal contractors and contractor unions that were notoriously not just discriminating, but either segregated or entirely white. And so Kennedy announced that we should take affirmative action, quote unquote, to ensure applicants are employed without regard to race. So importantly, this is a different model than where we see into our diversity claims today. But nonetheless, the idea of affirmative action is tied very directly to this idea of we need to deal with discrimination in these big sectors. Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Democrat, Republican, continue these affirmative action plans, especially in contracting, especially in the building trades. And there seems to be a fair amount of success with this. John Donahue, a Stanford economist, argues with compelling data that during the 1970s and the late 1970s, that these affirmative action policies, again, that are focused on direct and quite pervasive discrimination, were quite successful, both in integrating unions and contracting firms and raising Black American wages and providing greater opportunities. The policies continue, again, related to discrimination. The steelworkers case of the late 1970s dealt with, again, very harsh discrimination. Police officers, a lot of targeting police officers, firefighters, and the like, where, again, the discrimination's pretty harsh and the affirmative action policies are pushing. Now, note here, as we get into the late 70s, the affirmative action isn't simply the government is saying, do something. It is starting to say the government is starting to say, not just do something, but do it now. And do it, make sure you do it. And so actually there's a lot of language during this time, the use of quotas. Quotas start to come in. They come in the steelworkers case. They come in a lot with police officers. Quotas no longer exist. They don't exist for very long. But the argument is we're not changing. We're not changing fast enough, and we need to change. And so there's a push and a push here. It's the same with disparate impact. That's the idea during the 1970s that the courts start to use statistics to show discrimination in these various spheres. But again, it's rooted in the fact that these are fierce discriminatory places. So times are moving, so let's move to education. Education really starts on a different track, starting with California v. Backey, UC Regents, in 1978. And there the diversity model comes in. The diversity model is different, right? It's not about, per se, discrimination. It's about the fact, well, on the one hand, the University of California Davis Med School did start, when it opened in 1971, 0 Black students, 0 Latino students. But the argument that they made was not discrimination, that these students were being discriminated against in getting in, but that there was a broader economic, socioeconomic racial disadvantage, and to represent the broader public at large and the fact that doctors and medical students were not diverse the way the state of California was and continues to be, that they should use a different form now of affirmative action to promote greater diversity within its ranks. And the Supreme Court here famously upholds the idea of diversity as a compelling interest to use race. But what it strikes down are other kind of broader forms of using race, certainly for quotas, or using race in more specific detail. it gives us a more amorphous sense of diversity. And diversity is a fuzzy word, whereas anti-discrimination, I would argue, is maybe a stronger word. And it sets the court on a course towards the Harvard decision. In between is Grutter, which this is a University of Michigan case in the early 2000s, and they take diversity on steroids. They argue that now, in Fortune 500 companies, MTV, the Pentagon, they all argue that diversity itself is a good thing. The diversity in the military helps us win wars in places that are not Europe and the white part of the United States. MTV infamously argues that they would never have discovered Ricky Martin or Shakira if they had not had Latino workers at MTV who would have pointed out, hey, there's this great scene. And if you remember back, I don't know how many decades ago this was, they were the music at that time. So MTV benefited from that, right? So this is very different than the anti-discrimination model that we start with. And it's something I think that starts to move into where both liberals and conservatives are like, where are we going here? And what are we doing with this? Note here too, though, and I've been told this when making the comments I just made before, that it does also, for people who even want the earlier anti-discrimination model, this is now the forum in which they go forward. It's this diversity model. So everyone has to join, because this is the law, and this is how it follows. Interesting, I'm going to move to the data in a moment, but interesting on the Harvard case that came out just a couple years ago, the Harvard case starts as an anti-discrimination case. It's an anti-discrimination case against Asian Americans, and the argument initially is not that Asian Americans are being discriminated against because of affirmative action. It's that Asian Americans are being discriminated against in their applications because they are being seen as narrow, as boring, as not well-rounded, as not able to do certain types of topics. These were stereotypes. This had nothing to do with affirmative action. This was just discrimination, straightforward discrimination. As the case moved along, it moved towards affirmative action. That's part of who the litigants were and the agendas that were there. And so it then moves towards this affirmative action and the role of diversity, following Grutter and Bakke. And here, the diversity model gets struck down. Okay. So let me switch here to the data, and then I'll close. So the data again is also complicated. And again, as I said at the beginning, I appreciate Jason's work here in engaging with data. And trying to argue, cite a lot of, again, my colleagues, with arguments as to why affirmative action isn't working. He starts with his central claim, I think that's right, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that Black Americans were steadily improving on many economic and educational measures between 1940 and 1970, and he cites Robert Putnam and Romney Garrett. The Upswing is the book for a few years ago that makes this argument that things slow after 1970, so that there is a extensive success. Black poverty rates declined by half between 1940 and 1970, and then he argues that after 1970, the affirmative action and civil rights muddy this up and create problems, and he has a variety of them, which I won't get into, that then lead not that things have stagnated, but they've slowed. And we have, since 1970, dealt with this slower feature. He's absolutely right about this distinction, although there are scholars who argue that it's not 1970, it's closer to 1980. 1980 would be meaningfully different than 1970, as I'll mention in a moment. But there's arguments as to why between 1940 and 1970 there is this huge decline in poverty rates. The big arguments that economists typically give, and that Putnam and Romney Garrett give, is number one, the Great Migration, African Americans leaving the South to the North, leaving agriculture to industry, and getting better jobs and higher wages and the like. World War II, which is a huge job investment thing. Many African Americans not only left to go to industry, but they went to government-funded building of ships and in the various places out on the West Coast, all the ports and the like. So that's the third being unions. Unions become legal in 1935. The union movement accelerates to more than a third of the workforce. African Americans to this day, like Latinos, make on average $250 to $300 more a week if they're a union member than not. So these are big things that are going on, big features of this period. Now, post-1970, Jason, argues that affirmative action is this big difference, right? This is the affirmative action myth. Affirmative action enters in here and creates these problems. But again, most of the scholars, and Putnam and Romney Garrett, they don't argue this. They argue that it's white backlash. Others argue that it's deindustrialization. It's attacks on unions, and unions decline precipitously during this time. The 1990s is indicative here. In the 1990s, poverty rates actually do drop quite a bit again. That's during the Clinton administration. I'm not here actually to defend the Clinton administration. I think what it is, and to reflect on this, I'm getting close to time, is that the economy was great. And so actually the poverty rates again declined, but what doesn't decline in the 1990s is the gap in wages between blacks and whites, and that's because everybody's doing well in the 1990s. So I just think affirmative action is too small a policy to have these kind of impacts, and I look forward to having this discussion. All right, so I was going to do a second area, but I'll save that for my 5 minutes, and let me then conclude as to why I think I'm going to give myself the liberty of one more minute here. I guess you get 16 minutes too, right? All right, I'm okay. All right. So let me conclude. Inequalities remain. I didn't bring up the huge inequalities that exist. Jason and I agree on these inequalities. They are rampant across spheres: education, housing, employment, wages, on and on and on. They are huge. They have remained, as he well puts in his book. I think we need to maintain the scaffolding. Part of the reason we need to maintain the scaffolding of affirmative action with anti-discrimination is it forces us as employers, it forces us in education to remind ourselves why, if we're hiring somebody white, why we're doing it. We in my job have to give specific reasons for why we make the hires we do. And that forces us to think outside a box. We've seen a lot of conversation now that without affirmative action, people have discarded these kind of mechanisms, seemingly boring, that we follow to push ourselves to think outside the box. I like to bring up Mina Kimes here, the ESPN football announcer. She doesn't fit the typical qualifications. She's not a former football player. She's not a former football writer. She actually came out, I think, as a journalist, a non-sports journalist. But she's excellent, and she's done really well. And so affirmative action, I don't know how she was hired, but it forces us to pay attention to this. It reminds us, I'm going to finish, that race is real. That race is a reality. It remains reality. That doesn't go away even when the Supreme Court says it should go away in Shaw v. Reno in the 90s, Plessy v. Ferguson. And then finally, I think that our current moment says it all. Thomas Sowell, back in 1970 or so, argued that part of the problem of affirmative action is that as a black professor, he was thought to be an affirmative action hire. And that wasn't fair. He had been a professor before. He was a very distinguished professor and the like. I think we see with Charles Q. Brown, with Jackie Robinson, everybody's a DEI hire again, right? Pete Hegseth, who was in the military for a few years, fires Charles Q. Brown, five-star general. He's a DEI hire. Jackie Robinson gets removed from a website. I guess he's a DEI player, right? That's his claim to fame. He was just the first black player, not an excellent baseball player, right? One of the best baseball players ever. So we see how this turns, to trust the fact that, hey, if we just get rid of affirmative action, if we just stop talking about race, everything will go back to good directions and we'll move forward. I think we're too optimistic, and I think our current moment says all of that. So I apologize. I probably went 2 minutes over. Okay, yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jason, you get 17 and a half minutes if you want to take it to present your case. Of course, you can take 13 minutes if you prefer. That's optional. But 17 and a half minutes, you're going to feel the hook, tail your hand. So take it away, Jason.
Sure. So tonight's proposition is that the Supreme Court's 2020...
A little bit more to the mic, Jason.
Tonight's proposition is that the Supreme Court's 2023 decision on affirmative action in higher ed marked a significant regression in the pursuit of racial equality. I not only disagree, I think the proposition gets it exactly backwards. What's been regressive is allowing racial preferences to flourish for 50 years, not ending them. The court ended affirmative action because in practice, it amounted to racial discrimination, which violates both the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which means these policies are not only illegal but also unconstitutional. Now, if you're someone like me who thinks discrimination against black people is wrong, how can you ignore or make excuses for discrimination that targets other races and ethnicities? Either discrimination is wrong or it isn't. Whether it's wrong shouldn't depend on who's on the receiving end. But there's another reason the court got the decision correct. Racial preferences are not simply unjust. They also haven't worked as intended. And in many cases, they've been counterproductive. The intended beneficiaries, low-income blacks, have retrogressed in many areas under these policies. And that's where I'd like to focus on in my opening remarks. Just a quick show of hands. Has anyone here seen the movie Hidden Figures? Okay, well, for those who haven't, it's a movie that was released about 10 years ago. And Hidden Figures tells the true story of three remarkable black mathematicians who helped NASA launch the space exploration program in the 1950s and 60s. Their names were Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, and Katherine Johnson. Vaughan taught computer programming to other black women after World War II and eventually became the agency's first black supervisor. Jackson became NASA's first black female engineer. And Johnson calculated the rocket trajectories for NASA's first human space flights in the early 1960s, as well as the trajectories that helped land Neil Armstrong on the moon in 1969. Now, the film's primary focus is the everyday lives of these women working at NASA, how they coped with the ugly racist and sexist attitudes of the Jim Crow era. But Hidden Figures is more than a story about unsung black math whizzes. It doubles as a story about black upward mobility in the post-war period, progress that was taking place notwithstanding all manner of laws and policies and customs that openly discriminated against blacks. The movie is based on a book of the same name by Margot Shetterly, the daughter of a retired black NASA scientist. And Shetterly's book goes much deeper than the film does into describing the working class and middle class black communities that produced these remarkable women. Vaughan was born in 1910. She attended Wilberforce University, which is the oldest black college in America, where she majored in math and graduated in 1929. At Wilberforce, a professor recommended her for graduate study in mathematics at the historically black Howard University in Washington, D.C., where the department was run by two black mathematicians who had earned their doctorates from Cornell and the University of Pennsylvania. Mary Jackson was a second-generation college graduate who earned degrees in math and physical science in 1943 from another black college, Hampton University. Shetterly writes that Hampton's philosophy of black advancement through self-help, quote, mirrored the aspirations and philosophy of the surrounding black community, unquote. Katherine Johnson, the book's third heroine, was born in 1918 and attended the West Virginia Institute, another black college, where she was mentored by one black professor who earned his doctorate in math from the University of Pennsylvania in 1933, and from another black professor who had earned advanced degrees in chemistry and math from Cornell. These thumbnail sketches of black America in the early and middle decades of the 20th century may surprise people today who have come to associate black communities with crime and violence and underperforming schools and single parenting and high levels of unemployment. The book is a reminder that things used to be much, much different. When Dorothy Vaughan first arrived in segregated Newport News, Virginia in 1943, to start her job at NASA, she lived with an elderly black couple in the city's East End neighborhood. The couple owned a grocery store. Shetterly writes that the East End was, quote, a larger version of what Dorothy had left behind in rural West Virginia. It was, quote, populated by stable Negro families in well-maintained homes, thriving local businesses, and a growing middle class, unquote. On the corner of the block where Vaughn lived, a pharmacist had just purchased a lot and was opening the city's first black pharmacy. A new hospital had just opened earlier in the year, organized by black doctors and constructed by black architects. Again, this is 1943. The point here is not to romanticize the Jim Crow era or downplay the importance of civil rights bills that were later passed to end it. The point is to illustrate what blacks were capable of accomplishing and did accomplish, despite Jim Crow and without racial preferences. The story of what was happening in America among black people who were only a couple generations removed from slavery and still living under legally enforced segregation has received nowhere near the amount of attention that it deserves. It defies our expectations. It challenges a lot of what we think about American history. It also seriously undermines claims that black people need affirmative action to get ahead in the U.S. One of the things that struck me in the run-up to the Supreme Court's decision in 2023, and what led me to write my book, was all the apocalyptic talk of what would happen in the absence of these policies. Politicians and academics and cable news commentators insisted that if affirmative action went away, black people would be devastated. They said there would be no more black upward mobility in this country. They said affirmative action had created the black middle class, and that without it, college campuses would be whitewashed. And I said to myself, wait a minute. That's not what the data show. That's not what the historical record shows. That's not what the experience of Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson and Katherine Johnson tells us. There was a significant black middle class before affirmative action, and it was growing at a far more rapid rate than it grew in the era of affirmative action. Between 1940 and 1960, for example, the black poverty rate fell from 87% to 47%. That's not only before affirmative action, it's before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's before not only a black president, but also before blacks had any significant political clout in this country. Before black mayors ran big cities with large black populations. Before majority black city councils existed. Before there were black school superintendents and black police chiefs of major cities. During the 1970s, the first full decade of affirmative action, the black poverty rate continued to fall, but at nowhere near the rate it had been falling in previous decades. Affirmative action has been given credit for a trend that predates its existence. The reality is that black people lifted themselves out of poverty. It wasn't due to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs or to affirmative action, both of which came later. And poverty rates are hardly the only evidence of this. During the first two-thirds of the 20th century, well before affirmative action and an expanded welfare state supposedly came to the rescue of blacks, blacks experienced significant progress that was never close to being replicated in the affirmative action era. Education gaps narrowed, black incomes rose, so did black homeownership rates. And they just didn't rise in absolute terms. They rose relative to whites, which means black-white gaps were narrowing. Blacks were catching up. In the 1940s and 50s, the percentage of blacks who earned high school degrees more than tripled, growing at a much faster rate than among whites. And more blacks were entering college and completing college. But as colleges began compromising their admission standards in the late 1960s to admit greater numbers of black students, these trends slowed. As my debating partner mentioned, according to Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam, education gaps that had been narrowing started to widen. Now fewer blacks were completing college relative to their white peers. Putnam writes that the fastest and most dramatic progress toward parity between blacks and whites finishing high school was achieved before 1970. But after 1970, the relative rate at which blacks were completing college dropped, then flatlined, and never recovered its previous upward trajectory. In fact, today, writes Putnam, after more than 50 years of racial preferences in higher education. Blacks are completing college at a lower rate compared to whites than they were in 1970. And we're having a debate about whether ending affirmative action is regressive? A similar story can be told about black income. More education meant better jobs and higher pay. And as educational gains among blacks had been faster than among whites, just as they had been faster among whites, in the decades prior to racial preferences in college admissions, wages for black workers were also rising at a faster pace than they were for whites. In other words, racial gaps in education and income were shrinking in the decades before racial preferences in hiring and college admissions. If anything, racial preferences have done more to throttle black upward mobility. The black-white disparity in family income in 2018 was approximately where it was in 1968. Again, affirmative action policies have received far more credit than they warrant, mainly because the proponents get the sequence wrong or start the story in the middle. It's also worth noting that by the time the Supreme Court issued its ruling in 2023, a number of states, Texas, Florida, California, Michigan, large, diverse states, had already banned the practice. What happened? In Texas, after race preferences were banned and replaced with race-neutral policies, black enrollment at the University of Texas rose. The same thing happened at the University of Florida. In California, racial preferences in college admissions had been banned way back in 1996 through a ballot initiative. What happened there? Well, at the most elite campuses in the University of California system, UCLA and Berkeley, black admissions initially fell. But throughout the UC system, black admissions rose, and so did graduation rates. Why? Well, one of the most devastating consequences of affirmative action in higher ed has been the systematic mismatching of students in schools. Students who would be on the dean's list at a less selective institution are funneled into more selective schools. To meet diversity goals, smart and capable black students have been admitted to colleges with academic credentials far below those of the average student at the same school. Subsequently, these black students have struggled academically, they've dropped out at higher rates, or they've been forced to switch to easier majors. Once California banned racial preferences, black students were more likely to attend schools in the system where they met the credentials of other students. And black GPAs and graduation rates throughout the UC system increased significantly, including in the more difficult STEM fields, math, engineering, computer science, and so forth. In other words, affirmative action, a policy intended to increase the ranks of the black middle class, had in practice resulted in fewer black doctors and lawyers and architects and engineers than we would have had in the absence of the policy. I'll stop there.
All right, rebuttal, Paul, take it away.
Thanks. Thank you. Those are great comments. I appreciate them. And let me just comment on a few. And I'm going to go backwards in the sense I'm going to start where he ends and talk about university admissions and this mismatch theory. He cites there for that Richard Sanders, who did the kind of first big mismatch theory, data theory, looking at law schools. And that's a controversial theory, and there's arguments. People have found some arguments in favor of it. He cites as well Peter Arsa, I can always pronounce his name, Arsa Disanio, who also finds arguments, and he specifically in the UC system finds arguments for mismatch theory. But he also argues there's some mismatch theory, but he also argues that there's a lot of evidence, not from just from himself, from him and from others, that African Americans getting into elite schools benefit from a lot of the things that elite schools provide. Better funding, better mentoring, better teaching. In fact, he says in the UC system, when he shows that at that time, that students at places like Merced and Santa Cruz and Davis, not Berkeley, UCLA, but these, somewhat secondary UC schools. I'm from the UC system, so I'm proud of my system as a whole. But to the degree that they argue this. He says it's not just that these students went from Berkeley to and UCLA to supposedly, lesser schools. They also, the UC system pumped a ton of money into these programs, and they really tried to make this work in a way that most places do not. So he himself sees mixed reactions on mixed match theory. Sanders his study has never been replicated. Ian Ayres at Yale, the Yale economist, Daniel Ho, the Stanford economist, they are among others who have found the whole theory to collapse. They have argued alternatively that affirmative action, that the end of affirmative action in these places leads to lower black students and lower graduation rates. Most recently, I think just this year or last year, Zachary Bleemer, an economist at Princeton, wrote in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, looking again at the UC system, that mismatch theory, again, there's a little bit of evidence, but primarily it doesn't work. And not just that students, in his study, he takes it up into the 2020s, the other studies were earlier, students are not doing well at the other schools. Many students aren't applying to any of the schools. And he finds that the students who are both not being admitted and being admitted to these supposed secondary schools, that they have less likely to have jobs in their 20s and 30s, and less likely to have higher paying jobs. So he sees lots of dramatic impacts, and it's a pretty strong take on mismatch theory. Now, I'll say with all of these, Bleemer and the others, they all say the data here is still ongoing. And that's part of the shutdown of all this. This is still a process moving forward, and they're all engaging with this. But certainly, the data is mixed, if not skewed towards the benefits of affirmative action. Now, more broadly, so I am a policy scholar, and part of being a policy scholar is you think policy matters, and that we have great individuals all over our country and great stories. The policy process has to try to deal with systemic inequality. And there's a reason why in the civil rights era in the 1960s, the government felt the need to enter in with policies. There has always been improvement. There has continued to be improvement. That some of the stats or the claims you were making about things getting worse and or not better at all, the data shows it's still getting better. It's just slowed compared to those early years, which again, I think is largely a result of dramatic economic changes, a dramatic change in the movement of people in World War II and the like. And also, those are numbers that are going from what, about 90% poverty in 1940. Also, there's no actual poverty statistic. It's kind of gleamed from the census, but really it's 1959, I think the census first has data that is meaningful. But that does, it goes from about 90% to about 45%. There's a reason the civil rights movement happens and we get the Great Society. We couldn't just rely on these great stories, and they're great stories, but policies try to deal with systematic problems, and they're mixed bags of policies. That's what policies are, but they have been working. They were working for a while. The fact that I said in the very beginning that a lot of people point to 1980 as opposed to 1970 as you do is because in 1980, President Reagan starts to really push back on a lot of this. And so things that were working through the 70s, there's a lot of big pushback. Final point, and I'll stop. The 14th Amendment is not clear on the use of race. Plessy v. Ferguson, the famous dissent by Justice Harlan, he talks about anti-classification. That means do not use race. He also talks about anti-subordination, and that allows for that you have to take race into account, and you have to take discrimination into account. That's a huge debate. It's an ongoing debate, but it's emphatically not the case that the 14th Amendment is colorblind, emphatically. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Jason, you got 5.5 minutes of rebuttal since your esteemed partner took that extra minute. Just keep it even.
Okay. A couple things. There's a lot of putting words in my mouth in that rebuttal. I never mentioned Richard Sander in my remarks. Richard Sander has written about the mismatch effect, but long before Richard Sander wrote about it, Thomas Sowell wrote about it. Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom wrote about it. Macklin Fleming wrote about it in the 60s. Derek Bell wrote about it in the 1970s. Sander came to this game in the mid-2000s, I believe. But I didn't mention Sander. You mentioned Sander. But his work has been supported by many who came before him. He's not the only one who's been saying these things. Others have said them and been saying them for a long time. You mentioned Peter Carciadono, another person you said I cite. I didn't cite Peter. But I can talk about Peter's study with respect to affirmative action. I didn't cite him in my remarks. You mean, are you talking about people I cite in my book or people I cite in my remarks?
Guys, talk to each other later, please.
But
please address the audience.
in any case, Peter Carciadono, I'm probably mispronouncing his last name as well, is an economist at Duke University who was a expert witness for the plaintiffs in the Students for Fair Admissions case. And Peter did a study trying to tease out the mismatch effect. He did it at Duke University in the late 2000s, I think 2010, 2011 initially. But what he did was he looked at entering freshmen, male freshmen at Duke, asked them what they wanted to major in, took a sample of these replies, and then compared that with whether they ended up receiving a degree in that major 4 years later. And what he found is that black male students were more likely than white male students to want to major in the natural sciences or economics as freshmen than their white counterparts. But the attrition rate out of that major or those majors was phenomenal 4 years later. So somewhere around 70% of black males said they wanted to major in the natural sciences or economics, and only about 35% ended up with a degree. So a 35-point attrition rate. Among the white male students, the attrition rate was about 4 percentage points. He wanted to find out what was going on here. And he concluded that the attrition rates, the difference there can be entirely explained by the credentials students had when they entered Duke. Like many elite schools, Duke does admit some black students who meet the credentials of the average student at Duke, along with black students who don't meet those credentials. And Peter's study teased out the difference. Those black students that met the credentials of the typical Duke student had no problem studying the major they intended as freshmen and went on to obtain a degree in that field. Those black students that did not meet those credentials initially explained all of the difference in attrition rates. I think it's a very powerful study, and it was cited in his expert witness testimony in the Supreme Court case. I'll take on one other argument that a lot of proponents of affirmative action make, which is that even if you, these kids, some of these kids, minority kids, what have you, don't have the credentials of the average student at the school, at least they'll be attending a better school and they'll get a better education, as the professor argued. Well, there have been studies tease out that effect as well. One was a comparison of black law students at Howard University, a historically black law school that does not use affirmative action, and black law students graduating from George Mason University, a more selective school than Howard, which does use affirmative action to admit black students. And this study compared passage of the bar on the first try. It turns out that the students at Howard passed the bar on the first try at significantly higher rates than they did at George Mason Law School. More than 50% at Howard, less than a third at George Mason University. So I ask you, did those black students who were admitted to George Mason University under affirmative action policies in fact receive a better education because they were going to a more selective school? I see my time running out, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right, Jason, I gave you 5.5 minutes, but you decided your time ran out. But all right, you know, you've turned your opponent, giving him a little affirmative action nudge. He's He's been taking all the extra time, and you sit down early, which is kind of funny. But okay, now we go to the Q&A section of the evening. But before you line up, first I want to say that the rule that I've decided on is that each debater gets a chance to ask one question of the other and to have a little follow-up discussion. That can be exercised at any time, now included. The moderator has a prerogative which I might take. First, Jason, is there at this point a single question that you would like to put to your opponent?
Sure. I was wondering if you could give us your working definition of affirmative action, because sometimes there's a little semantic debate over the meaning of the term. For some people, it means simply outreach, and that was, in fact, the original meaning of affirmative action in the 1960s when these policies were first proposed. We will take affirmative action to reach out to certain groups that had been overlooked in the past, whether it was in the labor force or on college campuses. And that would be, so outreach was affirmative action. Over time, however, and this is what the Supreme Court was pushing back on in the Students for Fair Admissions case, affirmative action has come to mean racial quotas, set-asides, racial discrimination, not simply outreach. So I'm wondering, as you argue against affirmative action, what definition you're using.
Arguing for affirmative action, I might say. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes.
Answer? Yeah.
Yes. Put the mic
yeah.
in. Give the mic in.
So as I said in my talk, affirmative action actually starts as active anti-discrimination. And so it's used not just to try to diversify the fields, but to combat systematic, comprehensive discrimination by employers against workers. Workers were not getting jobs. They were being discriminated against. And so affirmative action was used as a wedge, not to say, it's not enough to then admit one person or two persons, as Brown v. Board of Education dealt with in the school context with tokens. We needed bigger numbers. So the Steelworkers case v. Weber of 1979 uses quotas to say this is now 15 years after the Civil Rights Act, Title VII, which prohibits discrimination, and you haven't done anything. And so you got to do something. And so it starts to push this type of affirmative action. It's very directly related to anti-discrimination. Now, as I said in my talk, that changes, and especially in the university context, because Bakke, the Supreme Court, starts to water down these more aggressive counters to inequality and discrimination and start to focus on diversity. And part of that does come from UC Davis itself, pushing this. We need a more diverse med school. We need more diverse doctors. And there's positive things about diversity. And there's a whole literature and there's a whole set of court cases from the 70s and 80s. Most of them are kind of out of date and probably not agreed upon anymore. But for a while, and it culminates in that Grutter case that I mentioned. Diversity itself is good. America is better when there's diversity. My classroom is better. People learn better when there's diversity in the room. We need these diverse viewpoints. So that pushes far from affirmative action. Grutter keeps this diversity model. As I said, the Harvard case, I don't remember the quotas, what they're dealing with now, pre-Harvard case, and even still, because the Harvard case actually leaves this open. The Harvard case says what happens after Grutter is this plus system. So you get a plus if you're from Utah. You get a plus if you're on the soccer team. You get a plus if you do fencing. Fencing became all the rage. Squash became all the rage, right? You had these certain things that everybody was doing. Taekwondo became all the rage. My kids are doing Taekwondo because of that. But it's no longer the rage. They got to find a new one. So all these pluses, race was a plus. National origin was a plus. Speaking another language was a plus. All on and on and on. It was a plus system. And that had been going for decades. A lot of people criticized it. A lot of people on both sides is like, what are we doing here? You're just adding this plus. But it was because universities were following Grutter. And then Harvard pushes down on that. It says you can't use race at all. But they do say, this is where it's not that different than Grutter, I don't think, is they say your essay can talk about who you are. And that's your opportunity to talk broadly about who you are. You're on the fencing team. You are also, the son or daughter of immigrants, and you escaped, wartime, whatever. So that's the model. Quotas have not been allowed for a long time, although they're still allowed when there is specific discrimination, if this entity, this space, discriminated over a series of years, we can still use quotas to mandate that a change is made. But in general, quotas have not been allowed for a long time. I don't remember the Harvard case saying anything to that effect. But I could be wrong. I haven't read the whole, it's a long case. I certainly don't remember it.
Did you want to make any comment on that answer, Jason, or pass?
Well, the schools were telling us, schools like Harvard, and Harvard was not alone, but these schools were telling us that race was just one factor of many that they were using. But what we learned from the Harvard case, particularly through the discovery process, is that they were lying. Race was a huge factor. It was the factor. To give you an example, a typical Asian applicant to Harvard would have about a 25% chance of admission, a typical Asian American male applicant. If you kept his credentials, his academic credentials, test scores, class rank, what have you, GPA, all the same, changed his race from Asian to black, his chances of admission went up above 80%. So they were lying. We already knew that they were lying because of what happened after Prop 209 out in California back in the 90s. Once, again, the California system has been telling us for decades, no, we're not capping Asian enrollment. No, we're not discriminating. No, race is just one factor of many. After UCLA and Berkeley could no longer use race as a factor in admissions, Asian enrollment spiked. It went through the roof at those two schools, which is one of the reasons you saw the Asian American community pushing back so hard when California tried to reinstate racial preferences through a ballot initiative in 2020. Not only did it go down badly at the ballot box, but Asian Americans led the fight to defeat it because they knew that their kids would be most affected by these policies. So the schools had been lying. One of the reasons that Students for Fair Admission settled on Asian plaintiffs this time, and that was different from previous cases the group had brought in the Fisher case and Gruder and Gratz and even Hopwood, going back even further, the plaintiffs had all been white, either white men or white women. Bakke, white man. One of the reasons they decided on using Asian plaintiffs in the Students for Fair Admissions case is because they had this data on Asian enrollment at Harvard going back to 1992 and going forward about 20 years to 2012 or 2013. They had 20 years of data on Asian enrollment at Harvard. In 1992, it was 15%. 2012, 15%. Harvard said it was a huge coincidence. And this was despite the fact that not only had the Asian population in this country grown tremendously over that 20-year period, but we also knew that schools, selective schools that don't use affirmative action, like Caltech, saw their Asian enrollment grow as the Asian population grew over the same period. So Harvard was lying. All of these schools were lying about how much they were weighing race in admissions, and the Supreme Court finally called them out on it.
Paul, would you like to ask Jason a question or waive it at this point? I want to ask just one question from you both. We are talking about students who graduate who basically face a capitalist system in terms of their hiring potential or in terms of their ability to flourish economically. No, we're going to take away affirmative action from school, discourage it, I guess, from the employment market, leaving them with a capitalist profit and loss system to cope with in terms of their economic opportunity. Is it your view, either Paul or Jason, I'll start with that one of you, that the capitalist system inhibits, penalizes, discourages racial discrimination? Does the capitalist system encourage racial discrimination, or is my question pretty irrelevant, or is it neutral to racial discrimination in hiring or in economic opportunity in terms of the way the capitalist system works? Do you have an answer to that, Paul?
That's a huge question. It's a big question. Richard Epstein wrote about this decades ago, arguing the capitalist system punishes those who discriminate, because if you discriminate against the best people, you will do less well than others. That's led to a huge debate. The question is, in certain spheres where it is very tangible that discrimination on the basis of one person will dramatically affect, the LA Dodgers and Jackie Robinson, the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. The Chicago Bulls decided to go with Tony Kukoc over Michael Jordan at a certain point in time. That was probably something that punished the Chicago Bulls, and it punished them for about 30 years. So we see that tangibly. But most businesses are so big, the capitalist system is so big. I think the arguments are more that the capitalist system is neutral and that you need laws to regulate it, to punish those who don't follow the incentives of the capitalist system. There's an ideology there that you raise and that Epstein raises, and there's something to that, but there's a lot of evidence that it doesn't work in the ways we want. And the idea of anti-discrimination laws to try to push that where companies do what you asked for, what we hope.
Same question to you, Jason.
I think that's a pretty good summary of the debate. It goes back a lot further than Epstein. Gary Becker, the Nobel laureate, wrote about this. The 50s. Milton Friedman wrote about it. And the argument is that capitalism is not going to eliminate discrimination altogether, because probably nothing will. But it will put a price on discrimination. If you own an apartment complex and refuse to rent to certain racial or ethnic groups, and the units sit empty month after month, you're gonna have to swallow that. If you own a business and refuse to hire certain people, and you have to hire other people at a higher price instead of other willing workers at a lower price because you don't like their skin color, you're going to put your business at a competitive disadvantage. You could lose market share, and on and on. So that is the argument, that capitalism does a better job of any alternative system of putting a price on discrimination, and therefore it's preferable to other types of systems.
Okay. Questions from the audience, please line up in front of the mic. Do I see a question here? Okay, please ask a question as a question, and no need to identify who you are.
Okay, my question is for Professor Frymer. So you basically said that the fact that the government felt the need to enact these policies in the 60s was evidence that something needed to be done. But that same government felt the need to accelerate involvement in Vietnam. In the 70s, they felt the need to enact price controls. In the 80s, they revved up the war on drugs. And in 2003, they felt the need to invade Iraq. So my question is twofold. One, how is the government feeling a need to do something, evidence that something needs to be done? And two, what evidence do you have that even if there is something that needs to be done, that whatever policy they have to enact is actually going to achieve the result that they're aiming for?
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, no, great question, and touche, right? I think. So one thing, actually, that affirmative action does is it requires places like universities and businesses to count how many people work there. There was a real resistance in the early 1960s from a lot of businesses when they were asked by the government, how many of your employees are not white? How many of them are not male? A lot of places didn't want to respond, and they knew the results weren't going to be great in a lot of places. So there is this accumulation of statistics in the 1960s that is pointing, to this material, to the fact that there are these systematic problems. There is the data. It's data that Jason points to as well, right? That there are certain racial gaps in a wide range, and they were higher in the 1960s, and they have dipped again, as I mentioned, at different times, but they were there. But so the first part of your question was, do we trust them? You're right. I mean, they're in Vietnam, they're in Cambodia, so I'm with you on these things. I was actually looking at 60s data on discrimination at the National Archives, and they had an announcement come over the loudspeaker. Kennedy assassination records are opening up. And everyone jumped into the line, like, let's check out the Kennedy assassination. I thought for a moment, like, hey, maybe I should get in there and see what's going on because, who knows? I mean, there was a lot of lying. Anyway, so that's part one. The second part you asked was, why do we trust that they would do something right? I think is something of that effect. Yeah. And, they come up with policies, right? Like they did with COVID, right? They come up with policies, some work, some don't, right? Some are disastrous. There's a groupthink that happens there. You parade these people into the room, the Dr. Fauci's and the like, who I personally thought did an admirable job and he was doing what he does, right? That is kind of what the government does, and they did that in this case. They bring in the employment economists and the like, and they try to come up with a policy. Affirmative action does kind of rise organically, again, as I've said, based on this anti-discrimination point, that they are trying. I mean, it happens the same again with Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court says no segregation of schools, and then a school admits one person and says, we're not segregated anymore, right? We're desegregated. And the Supreme Court, exasperated, says, all right, we meant more than one. Let's keep going. And the same thing happens in employment in the 60s. A lot of these places are very resistant, and so they keep getting these lawsuits and lawsuits. And so I keep mentioning the steelworkers case from 1979. That's 15 or so years after the Civil Rights Act, and the court is exacerbated. Like, we have been pushing this, and this isn't an affirmative action issue. These are steelworkers that are all trying to have jobs, and they're still segregating and they're still discriminating. Sheet metal workers in New York City, they were being sued until the mid-2000s until they said, we can't integrate because nobody wants to work with us. We have such a bad reputation. So they're trying. And I think affirmative action kind of follows organically from this of like, do something. All right, let's do quotas, right? Let's get harsh. I do this with my kids of like, you're not going to do this, we're cracking down, right? And not quotas, but I'm making sure that no phone time until you've eaten all your food and done all your studying. So that's the kind of element there. Is it the right way to do it? I don't think there's many people out there on either side that love the policy. I think a lot of people would love, people will say, we should give more money for education starting in kindergarten forward. That'd be great. It would be great if we did that. It'd be great if we put a ton of money into jobs. There's other issues here. Affirmative action, especially as it moves into schools, it's addressing to kind of handle things. DEI as well that comes out, especially post 2020 with Black Lives Matter. It's administrators throwing things at like, hey, we're doing something, right? They're trying to act fast. These aren't ideal policies, but affirmative action has been studied extensively. As I've said, the data is complicated, but the data points in positive directions. And even in some of the negative data, it points to reasons why we should still be thinking in a positive direction. So I hope that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's a great question.
Comment from you, Jason. Yeah.
Can you cite a specific example of how affirmative action has helped black people?
It's raised wages.
As I pointed out, wages were already rising.
They were rising
before affirmative action.
All right. Well, so take John Donahue. He's again the Stanford economist I mentioned in my first talk. They use causal inference methods that economists are good at using. He focuses on sectors, as I said in my initial talk. The data is hard to find here, right? Because affirmative action isn't that big a policy. This isn't like inflation. This isn't the impact of tariffs, right? This isn't Social Security. These are, even at the university level, we're dealing with what, 80 schools, 100 schools? Most schools admit pretty much everybody applies. So we're not dealing with great data, but to the degree that we've been able, he focused on the trade industry, and he found timing-wise that when affirmative action policies were used, they had an impact. The steelworkers case is a good example because the Supreme Court not only said you need to use affirmative action, the court said every year we want to see data that shows you're doing it, that you're integrating. And the data showed they did. They integrated and they joined, they had union jobs. And again, Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that African Americans in unions make hundreds of dollars a week more. Now we can debate that, that's another topic. But I'm not, I'm focusing on the statistics that are out there. The statistics show these benefits. The statistics show wide ranges at the university level of when students go to these universities, they thrive afterwards. So I mean, again, the data is complicated, but the data is there.
Okay. Next question.
I was wondering if we have any information about like hardcore implementation practices between different universities. Like, is affirmative action standardized between universities, or are they kind of doing like some sort of hidden quota? Also, do we have any information on how many people were admitted because of affirmative action over the last 50 years?
Can you deal with that question, Jason?
No, it's not a uniform process. Different schools have different policies. In fact, Harvard went to great lengths to try and convince the court that its admissions process was a trade secret that could not be revealed or made public. The court didn't buy the argument, which is why we got all this information about who was being admitted under which standards. But different schools do use different standards to admit students. I don't know raw numbers in terms of how many people have been admitted to schools under affirmative action. But you can tease that out by just looking. If you have data on the average, say, SAT score for the freshman class at Princeton, and then look at the average SAT score of the black freshman at Princeton, or Hispanic. And by the way, we speak about affirmative action. I just want to add this in terms of race, and in higher education in particular in terms of race, in college admissions in terms of race. But the mismatch problem that I'm describing transcends race. We know that one of the most important things in admitting a student to a school is whether that student's incoming academic preparation matches the surrounding students at the school. If it doesn't, that student is likely to struggle. It doesn't matter if the student's black. It doesn't matter if the student is the son or daughter of alumni. It doesn't matter if the student is an athlete. Like I've said before, if Harvard admitted left-handed redheads with SAT scores 300 points below those of the average student at Harvard, you would see left-handed redheads pooling at the bottom of the class. You'd see them dropping out at higher rates. You'd see them switching to easier majors. So this is a problem that really transcends race, the mismatch problem that I'm getting at.
Can I make a heartwarming anecdotal story in response to that? I'm winking a bit with my heartwarming story. I personally I went to UC Berkeley. I was admitted in mid-June after I graduated. And as I assumed, I was admitted probably about last at the school. I was initially put on a waiting list, and many months went by, and they admitted me in late June. They seemed to have some extra numbers available. And I actually sat up nights thinking, well, I'm last. I'm going to finish last. I'm going to go for the C minuses, and I'm going to try to get myself through. It doesn't work that way, right, among all the crowds. And I mean, this is anecdotal. I don't see that at Princeton either. I don't see the hockey players no offense to hockey players. If they're watching, they're great. I say hockey players because our hockey players often go to the NHL. They're a whole different track. So they're excellent hockey players, and that's their professional life. And I'm gonna stop getting myself in trouble with hockey players. I don't see that kind of pooling going on around. I teach right now in a big intro class. I just don't see that. I see a lot of students that are working hard, that are excelling in different ways, and maybe I'm missing it. This is all me being anecdotal on this point, but I don't see it. And I also, now switching from anecdote to data, the data about how important many of these universities of again, not just teaching better, but providing lots of funding. I mean, again, Princeton students, you get 4 years free funding. You go to, a CUNY, and you're going 9 years sometimes because the funding is not there. You've got to pay for it, even though it's a quite cheap university in comparison. But there's a lot of, the tutoring and so forth. I have, again, many athletes who knows how well they were doing on their SATs and the like. But they have really powerful study halls and mentoring, and they work super hard. I just don't this kind of idea that there's this crowd of people that just pool to the bottom. I don't know. Did we worry about, what's his name? Trump's son-in-law, whose dad gave Harvard millions of dollars. Did we worry he was pooling to the bottom with the other legacy students that were all also, sons and daughters of millionaires? And they were like, we're here, we're last, we're pooling here on the bottom.
I'm not worried about sons and daughters of millionaires.
I'm not either.
I'm
but-
worried about smart black kids that have been set up to fail at these schools that don't become engineers because they're trying to do it at Duke, where very, very few people can major in engineering, but would have no problem majoring in engineering at, say, North Carolina State. That's who I'm worried about. And there is hard empirical data showing that there are consequences of this. I'll cite one other study. At MIT did a study of black students there. Black students at MIT score in the 90th percentile on the math section of the SAT. Pretty smart black kids. Of all kids in the country, they're in the 90th percentile. But they're in the 10th percentile among their peers at MIT. So kids who would be on the dean's list, hitting it out of the park at a less selective institution, are struggling at MIT. And they are dropping out at higher rates, and they are switching to easier majors at higher rates. So there is empirical data showing this. It's not just anecdotal. I am not worried about the sons and daughters of millionaires. They will be fine. I'm worried about black kids who have been set up to fail, black kids who are being used as window dressing at elite schools to make the Quad look like America.
Question. Okay. Question.
So I remember that there's a Supreme Court quote that affirmation is supposed to be around just for like 25 more years, right? It's supposed to be a Band-Aid temp solution. We've had this for maybe like 50 plus years. Why has it been so hard to really fix the real root cause? And why have we always been relying for this solution for like much longer than we initially expected?
The root cause. Could you address the root cause question?
I think because college admissions is addressing the problem way too far downstream. The real problem is our K through 12 education system. You have black kids, graduating from 12th grade, being able to read or do math at the 8th grade level, and then sent off to college and told to enroll in a few remedial classes and it'll make up the difference. No, it won't make up the difference. And so we have a big K through 12 education problem in this country, and that's what we really need to address. And if we did address it, it would obviate the need for racial preferences when some 18-year-old sits down to take the SAT at that age. But these problems start much, much earlier, and we're trying to fix them at the college admissions level, and that's just way too late in the game.
I totally agree with that. The problem is there's no resources to do what we need to do. Affirmative action is an easier fix. It's not a good fix. I agree with you on that. It's not that we should start at kindergarten. We should start with daycare. We need to push a ton of money. Who's giving us that money, right? So policymakers respond with, here's the money we have. Department of Education's about to go out of business. Less, right? We don't have a lot of money. What do we do? How do we figure out ways to do it? And affirmative action evolves in, a problematic way, in the same way that we have, different policies across the sphere that kind of get at a little piece or try to get at a little bit more. I totally agree that we probably went too far in just putting all of our eggs in this one basket. I don't think that was ever the intent. But there's just no politics, there's no support for the bigger thing that we need to do, that we all agree needs to be done. Let's do it. As soon as we do it, I and most others who support affirmative action will readily drop out of that train. Let's do it.
Next question.
I was actually going to ask about the K-12 pipeline because neither of you mentioned it in your opening statements, and I think it's one of the most important factors of affirmative action. So I'll kind of pivot the question a little bit because clearly you both think it's important. You had very different ideas of why trends changed in the 70s to 80s post Great Society and with Reagan. And a lot of what changed during that time was K-12 education. So could you maybe talk about why you take your position as to the trends of minorities in higher ed and in their poverty rates as it ties to K-12, and why you think those, basically how your position might tie to the K-12 part of the conversation, if that makes sense.
All right, well, you started the K-12 point, Jason, so why
Well,
don't you take
I
the
can
question
say a
first?
few more words about K through 12. I would entirely disagree with the professor in terms of the problem being a lack of resources. New York City spends something like $40,000 a student, which is more than double the national average. And in fact, if you go to most major, I should say most large cities with large black populations have per pupil spending that is well above the state average. Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Chicago, on and on. So the issue is not money, nor is there some mystery as to how to educate these kids, what types of schools we could put them in to make them more college ready. We have wonderful charter schools right here in New York City, full of black and Hispanic kids who are so poor that they qualify for free and reduced lunch. They have test scores that are higher than the liliest white suburbs. We have tens of thousands of kids sitting on waiting lists to attend these charter schools because the city has capped the number of them. Why has the city capped the number of them? Because the teachers' unions do not like charter schools competing for their children. So it is not a problem of money. It is not a problem of not knowing how to educate kids from the most difficult backgrounds. It is a matter of political will. And that is the problem in K through 12, the major problem in K through 12 education today.
Comment?
I'll just say real quick, the data on charter schools is mixed.
Every time I say data, it's mixed, it's complicated,
It is. That's unfortunately, that's
but
the
your
reality of most
data
of these
is
things.
sound, along
No,
with your anecdotes.
My anecdote about myself is sound. I remember what happened to me. But the broader
Not only
data I
that-
kept saying was complicated. It's complicated data, and I had qualified every piece of data. I said, this, we're getting it from certain sectors. We're finding it from these different places. It's pushing in these different directions. The effects are small. That is data. That's what data looks like. I would love for the data to just be boom, way up to the top. It isn't. So we can just accept that, or we can, I don't know, keep debating. Charter schools, mixed.
To further your anecdote, you ended up getting invited to the SOA Forum.
That's right. Look at that.
Yeah.
This is from data to theory. We've talked a lot about mismatch theory, but I'm curious, are there any other theories, causal theories in the field that explain or discuss negative outcomes of affirmative action? Any other causal theories than mismatch theory? Thank
Negative
you.
outcomes. Well, I guess you're the negative guy, so in that case, so why don't you negate?
Well, the Supreme Court cited a number of other problems with affirmative action byproducts. One was negative stereotyping, reinforcing negative stereotypes with regard to blacks. If you attend a school, particularly a selective school, and a lot of the black students you encounter on campus seem to be struggling with their work or in class, and when you leave school, what is your impression of the academic or intellectual capabilities of black students? That was just one of the examples that the Supreme Court has cited. Earlier, the professor cited Thomas Sowell's experience about people assuming he was a product of affirmative action when he was teaching in the 1970s. That's a more complicated story, or it's a more extensive story. And the point is that Thomas Sowell started teaching in the 1960s, and nobody questioned his credentials or qualifications when he was teaching in the 1960s, because there was no affirmative action. He contrasts that with the way they started to question his credentials in the 1970s. So that is another negative byproduct of affirmative action.
Comment?
What do we do with Clayton Brown or in the DEI claims of the Trump administration? They're not. What do we do with that? Is this disturbing to you that they are looking at very high qualified people of color and women and saying they're DEI, DEI, DEI? Does that bother you? Or are they DEI and the problem is that affirmative action has made everybody DEI and we got to get rid of the whole thing and hopefully in 3 decades we can say that people are there on their merit?
I think that the government should not be picking winners and losers based on race. I think they should have a colorblind policy. And if the Trump administration is not doing that, then I oppose what the Trump administration is doing. I'm not here to carry water for Republicans or Democrats or Trump or anyone else. I support colorblind policies. They were the rock foundation of the civil rights movement. They work. That's what Martin Luther King was all for. That's what Thurgood Marshall was all for. Colorblind is treating people without regard to race. And finally, and I keep stressing this, it's not just that I think these policies are unjust, it's that I don't think they work, and I think they're counterproductive. And they don't just not work for blacks. You could argue that under Jim Crow, we had affirmative action for white people in this country. How did the whites under Jim Crow do? Well, white Southerners started the Jim Crow era ahead of blacks economically and educationally. And at the end of Jim Crow, they were still ahead of blacks educationally and economically. But they hadn't increased their lead. Nor had they narrowed the gap between Southern whites and Northern whites. Even under policies put in place to help low-income white people, the policies did not have the intended effect. And it's not just a domestic issue. You can go over internationally. We haven't talked about. These policies have not just been tried and failed here in the US. They've been tried in many places and failed in many places. In Malaysia today, there are policies in place that favor the Malays over the ethnic Chinese, who are the minorities. Yet the ethnic Chinese outperform the Malays, both academically and economically, and have for decades. Even though there are policies on the books in Malaysia that say ethnic Chinese people can't go to these schools or enter these professions and on and on and on. Chinese easily out-earn the Malays. There are too many examples of Jews doing this in country after country to even count. Laws in place discriminating against Jews, yet Jews outperforming. These policies don't work. They're counterproductive. And I think in a society as multiracial and multi-ethnic and pluralistic as the United States is, they're a recipe for disaster in terms of the racial resentment that comes with them.
Question.
Paul, you said something which you presented as a fact, but I think is an assumption, which is that diversity is better. And one of the things you said is that it's better in your classroom. And then you said something like, because people have different viewpoints and perspectives and experiences, and that makes my classroom better. And therefore, so are you saying that people look the same, will think the same, or have the same experiences and perspectives? And how is that in of itself not extremely bigoted? To say that because you have a classroom that looks different, they clearly think different, or they look the same, they clearly think the same. I find that to be incredibly offensive.
Sorry, you'd say. I appreciate that. I didn't say that I was saying that. That wasn't my fact. That was in Grutter.
But you said that about your own classroom. You said my classroom.
No, I was probably just talking about that as an example.
So is diversity better or not better in classroom?
To me, I don't know. I mean, you're right. I don't know. I wasn't making that argument. I was focusing. The Supreme Court. I gave my nice what do you call it? Shakira reference, right? Like it was this idea. That's what they were arguing, is that diversity was good. I guess in general, I have a student from England in my class. I'm teaching American politics. She's great. She raises all sorts of things that we wouldn't otherwise talk about because she's from England. I have, students that are extremely conservative, students that are extremely liberal. That's great. I don't essentialize people. I don't think we should essentialize people. I think most people who support affirmative action try hard not to essentialize. There are some that no doubt do. I think he cites them in his book, not in his talk. I think if you ask me, is diversity good or bad? I'm sure I would say good. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I'm not, the words you were saying, I was recounting what was the argument of the Supreme Court, and actually I was kind of negative about it, that shouldn't be the logic.
Coming from you
But a
about
good
diversity, Jason? No, okay. Question?
Yeah, Paul, the world has had a lot of experience with affirmative action, starting with the Soviet Union in the 1920s that ended in ethnic cleansing, as you probably know. Sri Lanka, India started it in the 1950s, and every single time it's been proposed, including in the United States, it's been proposed as a temporary solution to get us to a certain point, and at that point everything will be great and we'll stop it. India, 75 years later, still has affirmative action. Sri Lanka doesn't because that ended in genocide. But given all those programs, as a policy guy, can you tell me, first of all, at what point are you going to say that this is not working after 75 years or 100 years? What's the cutoff for you? How long do we need to try it in the United States before we actually say that, maybe this isn't working? Or do we wait for genocide like Rwanda had or Sri Lanka had?
Good question. No, I mean, seriously, good question. When does it end? I mean, I'm all in favor of reforms and trying to figure out new ways to do things. I'm not this rigid, here's one way to do it, it's our way or the highway, and nothing else works. What I do here, what I'm here to say about why we need to keep affirmative action is that it keeps us at a baseline that race does matter, contra Jason, who I respect his comments, but I think race does matter. I think racial inequality is there. Racial discrimination is there. And it forces us to remind ourselves of that before we go too far in the other direction. We've seen this with the Voting Rights Act. The post-Voting Rights Act, I would say, has not been great. We've seen all the kind of concerns that people said when you get rid of the Voting Rights Act. President Obama's first black president, we don't need a Voting Rights Act anymore. But all those concerns came back and have shown realities to them. So I think the policy, if you have a different version, where did you go? You over here, yes. If you have a different version, that would be great. I agree with you. We don't want to, we want progress. We want to figure out a way to get progress. I'm not beholden to one policy versus the other. I'm beholden, which I think Jason is too, to racial equality. I think we all are. And we're all trying to figure out ways to get there. And I think this policy has worked better than Jason does. I think this policy has problems, but has, the advantages that I was trying to say. So that would be my argument, if that's, I don't know some of those other cases. I read something briefly that India wasn't doing that bad on it, but I stopped reading after like a paragraph, so I'm not going to give you that one.
Commentation? Okay.
All right.
We unfortunately had to conclude the Q&A portion of the evening. I do want to say that both debaters have consented to come to our reception afterwards, and so you can corner them then and blast them with whatever question you have. But now we're going to the summary portion of the evening, and according to Oxford Cell rules, the affirmative goes first. 5 minutes of summary, and see if you can stick to the 5 minutes.
Actually, I'll be much faster. You want me to go up there?
Well, either one.
I feel like I kind of just gave a summary statement just before, so I feel like I've given a few of them. I'm good.
Oh, you don't want to do your summary?
No,
Okay.
I think I'm
You
good.
waive the summary. Okay, Jason, you gave up a few minutes, so you can do your summary.
I'll give up a few more. First, I'd like to thank the Soho Forum for inviting me here this evening and thank Professor Frymer for agreeing to participate. In closing, let me stress a few things. First, affirmative action is very popular with elites in this country, media elites, political elites, activists, and so forth, which is why you saw so many liberal politicians and academics and media figures bemoaning the court decision. But it's worth noting that most Americans, around 70% in fact, including absolute majorities of blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and whites, supported the Supreme Court decision, according to polls. which he'll tell you are flawed, I'm sure.
Actually, I agree with those. Those polls, affirmative action has not been
So
popular.
that's why
in
they're
polls
not
for a while.
flawed. He agrees with them.
I agree with
Color blindness has become a dirty word on the political left these days, but most Americans support colorblind policies, and history shows that black people have made greater strides under policies of colorblindness than under affirmative action. Secondly, nothing I've said this evening should be interpreted as an attempt to romanticize the Jim Crow era or to pretend that racism is somehow behind us. Jim Crow was a horrific period for blacks and an embarrassment for a country with our professed ideals. The point is not to suggest that blacks are advancing because of segregation. The point is that they were advancing notwithstanding it. Nor am I arguing that racism in America is somehow behind us or that it played no role in the hampering of black upward mobility. The challenge is figuring out how much of a role it plays in the 21st century and the racial disparities that we have today, and how much a role other non-racial factors might be playing. Blacks of a previous generation had to deal with a much more adversarial society. Yet, by many measures, they still had better outcomes in poverty reduction, in home ownership rates, in income gains, in educational attainment, and so forth. And all of it happened in the absence of racial preferences for blacks. In fact, a lot of it took place, as I said earlier, when there were racial preferences for whites. I'll close with this. Affirmative action is unjust. It undermines black achievement. It reinforces negative stereotypes. It leads to more tribalism and racial resentment in multi-ethnic societies like ours. And it makes black people, who largely lifted themselves out of poverty, look like a people who owe their advancement to government programs and preferential treatment. To anyone who knows black history, that is not only incorrect, it's insulting. Thank you.
Okay, Lucas, please open the voting. The final vote, yes, no, or undecided. The U.S. Supreme Court's 2023 decision to dismantle affirmative action in American higher education marked a significant regression in the pursuit of racial equality. Please vote yes, no, or undecided on that resolution, assuming you voted the first time. I want to remind everybody about the reception that both debaters are coming to. That's at Houston Hall. Look behind you, walk uptown 2 blocks, turn right, and you'll find Houston Hall. Follow a few of us. Follow me rather slowly if you need to, but please come to Houston Hall where both Jason and Paul will attend. I also want to take a moment to bring on the stage an individual who's run a debate society that has been inspired by the Soul Forum, and I wanted to make a brief announcement. Hekmet Abukatr, please take the stage and take 120 seconds to make your announcement.
Thank you. I won't pull up Paul. Thank you very much, Gene. And again, very much happy birthday, 81 years of age. Gene Epstein's legacy beyond these debates, he's run like 120 of them by now, and he's reached the ripe age of 81, is also influencing young people like myself to become acolytes of his debate mission. And that led me to start a sister debate society called Young Voices Debates that runs on a monthly schedule. So I just want to quickly announce the debates that we have coming up, and hopefully if you can, find me after the show. I'll give you a discount for our events. So on the 23rd of November, this Sunday, Daniel DiMartino and Micah Irfan will be debating the following resolution. U.S. drone strikes on Venezuelan drug trafficking boats fall within the bounds of international and domestic U.S. law. On December 2nd, not far from here in the Soho Playhouse, Max Blumenthal and Orlando Avendano will be debating the following resolution. The U.S. should militarily intervene in Venezuela. So if you're interested in Venezuela, find me after this debate. I would love to get you a discount. And thanks once more, Gene. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hekmet. Yeah. While you're still voting, again, we do debates every month. The next one will be Tuesday, December 16th, and that resolution will be about a monopoly and antitrust. It will involve Matt Stoller versus Jeffrey Manning. That will be back at the Sheen Center, so that the after party will be at our loft apartment. That's December 16th, and also at the Sheen Center on January 6th, where we've already been selling tickets on pretty big and surprising way. There will be a debate about child protective services, and that will feature Naomi Riley versus Martin Guggenheim. That will be a problem for Jason, since Naomi Riley happens to be his wife, but he'll deal with it. So she will be debating child protective services and its role against Martin Guggenheim, and that's at the Sheen Center. Again, I want to remind you that you're all invited to our reception afterwards. That's our second mission. Please help us fulfill it. Walk 2 blocks uptown, and to the right, we'll all be working together. Where do we stand on the voting? Now, I have in my dotage forgotten to bring the Soul Form Tootsie Roll that goes to the winner, but it will be sent to the winner when I get home and when I can put it in the mail. Okay, so now the resolution. Oops, I better put on my glasses. Drum roll, please, while I'm putting on my glasses. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's okay. Not bad. Not a bad job with the drum roll. Okay, fine. All right. All right. The yes votes actually lost 1%. So the yes vote went from 11% to nearly 12% to 11%. 12% to 11, so it lost 1%. So that's probably easy to be. The no vote gained 90 percentage points, went from 60 to 80. And actually, it does, so to speak, show that you can begin with a majority. Jason began with a majority of 60%, but contrary to common belief in Oxford-style voting, even if we begin with a majority, you can often pick up more votes. So the Soul Form Tootsie Roll does go to Jason Riley, and if you attend your wife's debate, I'll get you the Tootsie Roll. Congratulations to you both for a very lively exchange, and see you uptown at the reception. Thanks again.